All right. Thank you for coming today. This talk will be the first of a series of 3 that I will give in the next 2 months. The title is taken from President Obama's speech as U.S. Senator, and the title of that talk was An Honest Government, A Hopeful Future, which he gave at the University of Nairobi, Kenya, in August 2006. My second talk in this series, entitled Can the Nigerian Project Be Salvaged? That will be given at the Watson Institute of Brown University on March 13th. And the third talk, entitled Democratic Transitions and Development in Africa, Beyond Prebendalist Systems, will take place at Stanford University Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law on April 25th. And that talk, by the way, at Stanford is going to be followed by a 2-day conference on the question of democratic transitions and development in the Arab world. The aim of this first talk is to convey the persistent scope, intractability, and ramifications of a set of issues that are now actively debated in Nigeria. You would be aware of their pertinence to what is taking place in many countries worldwide. There is a global movement to, quote, claim democracy, in which questions are being raised about the fundamentals and outputs of governance in all systems, from authoritarian to procedurally democratic. They have recently moved to center place in commentaries on wealth, democracy, and inequality in the current US presidential election campaign. Recent upheavals in Nigeria have led me to orient this talk and the forthcoming one at Brown University to re-examine what I call the Nigerian Project. As noted in commentaries posted on the Brookings Institution and Buffett Center websites, I have been intensively engaged since 2008 in advancing reform ideas in Nigeria. The crippled giant of Africa, and in fact I have a copy of it here, a few books I've been able to grab. The crippled giant of Africa, to use the title of a book by Professor Egosa Osage, one of my former students and now a university president in Nigeria, can be only made viable and functional through profound structural transformations, political as well as economic. While both government and society agree on the need for such transformations, there is perplexity and uncertainty over how they would be achieved. Linked to these 3 talks is a collaborative program I am devising to address the issues discussed. We have to make use of international telecommunications to pursue engaged learning, knowledge acquisition, and remedial action in innovative ways. We are therefore videotaping this talk, but not the Q&A, as part of this wider endeavor. I first went to Nigeria exactly 36 years ago this month. As a young man, 30, as a lecturer in political science at the University of Ibadan. After 18 months, on leave with my family in Oxford, England, I wrote an article entitled Affluence and Underdevelopment, the Nigerian Experience, which reflected a fundamental shift in my understanding of the African post-colonial predicament. Most African countries are still stuck in the ruts of that predicament, despite recent improvements in GNP growth. As some of you are aware, in September 2011, a conference in my honor was held in Lagos, Nigeria, and to discuss the continued relevance of my book, a copy of which I have here, Democracy and Prebendal Politics in Nigeria, The Rise and Fall of the Second Republic, which was published in 1987. The coordinators of that project were Professors Wale Adebonwi and Ebenezer Obadare, and the chief patron was Dr. Kayode Fayemi, currently governor of Nigeria's Ekiti State. Dr. Fayemi was a former visiting scholar in the program of African Studies at Northwestern. A book on democracy and prebendalism in Nigeria, edited by Adebonwi and Obadare, will be published later this year or early next year, with a preface by Professor Larry Diamond of Stanford and an epilogue by me. A lively debate has ensued in the Nigerian media since that conference on how prebendalist practices are responsible for rotting roads, substandard health and education facilities, the deficient provision of electric power, water, and even fuel, and pervasive poverty. The national strike and mass protests that erupted in Nigeria in early January, following the removal of the petroleum subsidy, brought that nexus between corruption, abysmal public services, and pervasive distrust of government to a level of national debate comparable to the uprisings in North Africa. The REACH program on HIV prevention in Nigeria, 2006 to 2011, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, brought me once again face to face with these institutional deficiencies from the federal government in Abuja to the 12 local communities in which we worked. A good starting point for those wishing to grasp the dilemmas to be discussed today is a study I have used as a course book, Daniel Jordan Smith, I couldn't find it by the way, sorry, A Culture of Corruption, Everyday Deception, and Popular Discontent in Nigeria, which was published in 2007. And he is currently a professor at Brown University. I cannot provide today an examination of the upsurge of Islamist terrorism in northern Nigeria. If time permits, I will make a few remarks at the end. While these tragic events are fueled by the same insecurities, hopelessness, and anti-government feelings of young Nigerians in other regions, their virulence is spurred by economic stagnation and decline in much of the north, extremist religious views, the availability of firearms and explosives, misconduct of security forces, and manipulation by political and criminal elements. All of these can be minimized in the near term, I have argued, by smart power. But a comprehensive long-term strategy is needed to tackle the more fundamental issues. The fight of our time, and by the way, the fight of our time is taken from that talk that Barack Obama gave in Kenya in 2006. The fight of our time is also our fight. This was almost tragically brought home to Americans in the attempted bombing of the Northwest Airlines plane over Detroit on Christmas Day 2009. Court filings for the sentencing of Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, the convicted terrorist, just this past Friday, retraced the steps that almost led to the killing of 289 persons on board Flight 253. There is no opting out of the fight of our time and no safe havens. It requires many tools, especially the marshalling and sharing of the knowledge we possess and utilizing new methods to collaborate across space and time. As with the Africa Demos Bulletin, which I oversaw at the Carter Center during the time of the African Awakening in the early 1990s, the forthcoming program entitled AfricaPlus will provide opportunities, especially for young people, to put to effective use their command of new communication technologies here and in Africa. Okay, so the fight of our time. Exactly 10 years ago, for some reason there's a lot of anniversaries being taking place today. I gave a talk in this department and in this very same room. And in fact, when I initially agreed to give this input talk, what I was planning to do was to take that talk and to use it and to talk about, discuss different countries in Africa and to show the extent to which what I said they apply. Now, all I have done was take out the first words of that talk. So that's all you have today from that talk, but all of these materials are going to be made available as part of this project. All right, so that the study of Africa must contend with uncertainty, insecurity, and even catastrophe as persistent features of daily life. And there's no disguising the breadth and depth of this predicament and its connection to state erosion. I referred to this article I wrote 18 months after I left, I arrived in Nigeria. And here I have just printed for you the beginning of that talk, just the first lines of that talk. That is a well-known story that an individual wins a large fortune and is catapulted from rags to riches after a few years of dissipation. I highlighted few years because we would now say after a few decades of dissipation. The money has been squandered, the physical, mental health broken, glorious future of unlimited possibilities constricted into a bleak vista of regret and recrimination. I'm not going to be able to spend time on all the slides, but all of it is going to be made available, the talk and the slides, on a website. So if I had to write on Nigeria today, on affluence and underdevelopment, I could start again with what I wrote exactly 35 years ago. I gave an input talk 2 years ago, and I talked about the African predicament, and I have Stanislav Andreski, and a copy of his book here. And Kleptocracy or Corruption as a System of Government. This is the title of one of the chapters in Andreski's book, which was published in 1968. And you can read what he had to say here about how wealth acquired through illegal use of public office looms large. Top politicians, the salaries they amass. And then he had these words which I highlight. Until the military coup of January 1966 in Nigeria, which subsequently led to the Nigerian coup, Nigeria was providing the most perfect example of kleptocracy. Well, you could take out that until the military coup of January 1966, and then I would alter a little bit, say Nigeria provides one of the perfect examples that we have of kleptocracy. But all the rest of what he has to say, unfortunately, still apply. The losses of corruption, how much it exceeds profits, and then his idea that graphs distorts the whole economy. Now, prebendalism, when I finished this book, I thought, all right, here was this work I had done, and I had moved on. And I've pretty much been yanked back to now have to deal with it. But this was when I first came forward. It wasn't in 1987 in the book. In fact, this was an article that I wrote that was published in 1983. But what I said there in my notion of prebendalism, again, you know, quite frankly, those words still apply. That the state becomes the key distributor of financial resources. All governmental projects are subject to these intense pressure to convert them to individual and group accumulation. And then what does the state become in such a context? And that the statutory purposes of its offices are very much a matter of secondary concern. Now that last excerpt, the self-destructive tendencies of this system, I said, must be thoroughly understood. I think today we understand it. But the rest of that sentence, if ways can ever be devised to escape its debilitating cycle of renewal and decay, no, we do not know how to escape its debilitating cycle of renewal and decay. And that is very much before Nigerians and others. Now you'll see I have a number of references to Francis Fukuyama. Fukuyama's book, The Origins of Political Order, is for me one of the most important books published in the last 10 or 15 years. And I find Fukuyama's ideas very important. These are some quotes I took out from a recent article that he had in the Journal of Democracy. What he had to say about prebendalism: officials simply appropriate public resources without any obligation to take care of citizens. And that use of the word citizens is very important. They take care of people, but the idea of taking care of the citizens is not there. And then he talks about Asian governance with a lower propensity for rent-seeking and state capture compared to other regions. And I'm going to have a number of references here to the contrast between East Asia and a number of other countries, which I find extremely pertinent. This is something that, fortunately, my son was able to get it, to scan it, and send it to me. But this is a lithograph that we have from many years ago. And it's a greedy palm wine drinker. For those of you who are familiar with West Africa, palm wine drinking. Palm wine drinking is a communal practice. Palm wine doesn't stay very long. It spoils. So you get the palm wine, people come along and they drink the palm wine. So here is this individual. As you can see, he's very fat, but the way he has his palm wine jugs all clutched and the way he's open. But anyway, so this is my portrait of a prebendalist. National dysfunction and suboptimalism. These terms that I use here, the national dysfunction, in fact, one of the comments after the conference we had in Lagos, somebody who wrote an article on, or used my name, Richard Joseph, and the national dysfunction. this idea of this, the dysfunction of it. But also I talked about suboptimalism when I spoke at that conference. And my idea of suboptimalism is in fact the inability of being able to produce any optimal public goods. And so suboptimalism is a consequence of a lot of these developments. And Professor Toyin Falola, and the reason why I cite him is to give you an idea of the feelings of Nigerians in terms of the Nigerian intelligentsia and what he had to say about, what has gone wrong in our continent, the scourge of poverty. And then he ends up by saying the model of empowering Africa to dig out of this quagmire remains elusive. And that feeling is shared by many Nigerians of his generation. Now, Barack Obama, I was able to speak to him when he came here for commencement before he went out to give this talk. And my wife and I, in fact, happened to be in Nairobi that spring. And there was great anticipation for Obama's coming to Kenya as a senator in terms of expectation. But when he got up to give his talk at the University of Nairobi, it very much displeased his hosts because he spoke so much about corruption and what it actually means. But just look at his words there. The freedom you fought is threatened by corruption. People cannot trust their government to do the job for what exists to protect them and so on. All is lost. And that the struggle against corruption is one of the greatest struggles of our time. And by the way, and I have one of the books in terms of corruption in Kenya, and this is Michaela Wrong's It's Our Turn to Eat, which again, very displeased people, but in terms of understanding it. And then what he had to say here was rather interesting when I just went back and read it. And especially in light of what has happened in terms of the Africa Spring. When he said about, looking out at this crowd of young people, that I have found that you will find his faith. That if you decide your leaders will be held accountable and so on, and that, regardless of ethnicity or wealth, they will treat everyone the same. And in his statement, accountable, transparent government can break this cycle. And then his speech in Cairo, which has gotten so much praise, but it really had a whole list of all the things that people expect. And he has that sentence in there, which is really very much Obama's, for me, understanding of what is so fundamental. And that one of the things that people hope for is a government that is transparent and doesn't steal from the people. Nigeria, India, I consider one of the countries of most importance to Nigeria. In terms of the experience, federal democracies, complex countries, and so on. But also the ways in which India has had to struggle and still struggle with a lot of things that Nigerians are facing. And a lot of the inventiveness and innovations in India that I think is also so pertinent to Nigeria. So I just have a few quotes here about corruption in India. And in fact, you could just put Nigeria in it. I have Indian society and politics, just put Nigerian society and politics. And the scope and breadth of corruption within the Indian polity, just put the Nigerian polity. Now, I looked at that figure that Ganguly had there of estimating 462 billion between 1948 and 2008. And I remember from Nuhu Ribadu, who was a former anti-corruption czar in Nigeria, and his estimate of how much he believed has been lost in Nigeria because of corruption over a shorter period, which was like 400 billion. So, and I thought to myself, you're all very familiar with the Perception of Corruption Index, and the charts have come out. But I suggested there might be time for something new. And we have a lot of people here with a lot of mathematical skills, and I would call it Intensity of Corruption Index. And and I just put this forward, and you can come up with and my intensity of corruption index is, so if I take India's population, which is 7.5 times Nigeria, and I take the amount of money you could estimate, all right, I am saying that the intensity of corruption in Nigeria is greater than that in India. And therefore, you're not going to have all of these public works that you would expect on the basis of that. So, Larry Diamond is another person you'll see me citing. He's one of the people, along with Fukuyama and others, who are part of the thinking in terms of understanding this. And this is an article that he wrote in 1991, at the time of a lot of the transitions that were taking place in democracy in Africa. And he lists all the problems that Nigeria is going to face as it tries to move forward in terms of the democracy project. And then he concludes, he says, no problem is more intractable and more threatening to the future of Nigerian democracy than political corruption. And fast forward to 20 years, you'll come up with the same list of things. And then you still have to come up with that same basic thing. What is most fundamental to the blockage? Now, another article that I have called people's attention to, and I realized it the moment I read it. This is an article that Diamond wrote in Foreign Affairs on the rise of the predatory state and the rollback of democracy. And that article, I feel, is just so on the mark in identifying this very fundamental feature, and which today, again, especially in terms of what's taking place in North Africa and the Middle East, has come back, right? Talking about democracy and how superficial it can become, venal ruling elites who are contemptuous of the rule of law, accountable to no one but themselves. And then if democracies do not contain crime and corruption more effectively, generate economic growth and so on, people will eventually lose faith. And here's what he had to say about what happens in these countries, where he says the purpose of government is not to generate public goods, such as roads, schools, clinics, sewer systems, and so on. It is to produce private goods for officials, their families, and their criminals. And that if citizens lack confidence that politicians or political and political parties are serving anyone other than themselves. Now, similarly with Fukuyama, and I'm not going to go into it, but Fukuyama has this very basic triad in his book about the creation of capable states, having capable bureaucratic states, having a system in which those in government are constrained by some system, and as it advances, a system in terms of the rule of law, and then finally mechanisms of accountability. And I find that triad to be extremely important. But then he goes on to talk about the importance of high-quality state performance, and that if you don't have governments in that way, they in fact will become obstacles to economic performance. Further, he talks about the emergence of high-quality, centralized, bureaucratic states. And that in East Asia, even though you have your systems of corruption, here you have the emergence of powerful, institutionalized executive branch. And then the importance of Confucianism to this in terms of an ethical doctrine, where rulers have the interests of the ruled and not just themselves. And this final slide I have from Fukuyama. And in contrast to the highly predatory states that have emerged, Middle East, South Asia, and so on, and particularly Sub-Saharan Africa, where rulers have a developmental focus that they have maintained. Pursuing industrial policies in those states become possible. In the hands of a less capable state, what you result is a morass of rent-seeking and state capture. All right, back to Nigeria. How many of you are familiar with, have heard of Fela? Fela Ransom Kuti, Nigerian singer, brilliant. If I had the time, I'd play some Fela Ransom Kuti for you. And Fela Ransom Kuti, in terms of how important he has been, in terms of that consciousness about people in government, the police, and so on. But anyway, this is from one of his songs. I mean, it's in Pidgin English. He used Pidgin English a lot, but you don't have to know Pidgin English to be able to read it. Authority people, them go they steal, and the authority people of people in government. Authority man, know they pickpocket. Nah, plenty cash. That is just an emphasizer. Nah, plenty cash they're gonna steal. Authority man in charge of money. He no need gun, him need pen, right? And then with this final sentence, authority stealing past armed robbery. We African, we must do something about this nonsense. Right? And I remember when I read through the lines of this, I mean, it was just so very powerful. And in fact, one of the things I have here for you, these two authors I mentioned, Wale Adebanwi, and have just published a book called Authority Stealing, Anti-Corruption War, and Democratic Politics in Post-Military Nigeria. The first version of this they published in Nigeria, and the title was A Paradise for Maggots. And they came up with a more acceptable title. I have a quote here from John Gitongo of Kenya, and you'll all be familiar, I think many of you, as the anti-corruption czar. And in fact, what his experiences having to go into exile and so on is the same thing as Nuhu Ribadu, Nigeria's anti-corruption czar. And he was reflecting on what was going on in the Arab Spring, all right, and talking about how relevant that is to the African situation. And he said of the young men in Nairobi and Kampala stands. And he says, they are Africa's overwhelming majority. They are poor, marginalized, and they're angry about corruption and soaring food and fuel prices and the humiliations that they have to undergo. But it's very interesting what he had to say about soaring food and fuel prices, all right? Because Nigeria itself found itself exactly in a situation where that rage exploded. And I have just a few slides here today on what was revealed in Nigeria. As you all know, Nigeria is an oil exporter. It's a major oil exporter. It's the fifth most important oil exporter in the United States. Huge gas reserves. But the fact is that the oil industry in Nigeria is, you know, as Nigeria's former president said, is really represent the greatest institutional corruption in the history of the nation. I have a little quick summary there, that second statement, where I'm just summarizing. Nigeria exports most of its crude oil, and then you have oil, crude that is stolen, and that's also exported, some of it refined, you know, locally. And that's called bunkering in Nigeria. Now, Nigeria imports most of the gasoline and kerosene that the people use, all right? And the reason why, and that much of this now that's imported is highly subsidized by the government. And it's not only subsidized by the government, a lot of it is, in fact, re-exported and smuggled outside. And this is a system that's really built up over a number of years. Now, as a result of the crisis that emerged in Nigeria, and they were really, the government immediately, you know, removed the oil subsidy, prices went up, fuel went up, people were enraged. And when they really started examining it, for example, it turned out, and I just pulled this out, that it turned out that the government had paid for 559 million liters of petroleum, when the daily consumption was only 35 million. So it was even set up that the government was even providing a subsidy for far more, just in terms of how fraudulent this is. This is some more views as to why it is the system has grown up. The refineries are dilapidated, and so the government provides a cash handout to a cartel of wealthy people. Billions a year that goes into this. Now, Alexandra Gillies, it's in fact, when she writes a book on this, it will be the best book. Alexandra Gillies was here. She was the Assistant Director, Program of African Studies, with me. And she now is the Head of Governance at the Revenue Watch Institute. And she, in terms of understanding this system, and what I've pulled out here from what she has to say, is why it is that the government suddenly removed this subsidy. It just didn't make sense because they were facing, these terrorist incidents. And it's because the government was really in a very, very deep financial crisis. That the subsidy had now reached to over $9 billion in 2011. He said more than the entire federal government's capital budget. That the subsidy had doubled since 2010. And the reason is because of this very corrupt system. Now she goes on to say that in fact officials in government had allowed the subsidy to rise all these years because of the lucrative opportunities for corruption. And it's only when the actual petroleum company was facing such bankruptcy and owed so much money that the government decided to act. Now here's a message from Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Nigerian Minister of Finance. And this is taken from her message to this group of young Nigerians who are themselves involved in discussions. I'm involved with them. But here's what she's actually said to them. That we have major systemic issues arising from decades of unchecked corruption. And that the beneficiaries, they will just, that their interests are being threatened. She said it's not going to be any easy feat in correcting the system. And that what we need are not theoretical solutions, but solutions aimed at correcting the very ills facing the country. All right, here are just some more media commentaries having to do with the realization of the extensive kleptocracy that has emerged in Nigeria and how people became so impatient about it. Now, distrust, frustration, and anger. This is something that we're very much familiar with what is happening in terms of the Arab Spring. In the case of India, Ganguly talks about public anger and cynicism about the system. You know, you all have heard of Wael Ghonim, that Google executive in Cairo, in Egypt, and the role that he played talking about the decisions that have been made. And then the final quote I have here by Professor Okome, and she happens to be a former student of mine, who is also very active in this thinking about what is going on. And that why things that seem so predictable in other places become impossible in our country. These are more statements about the frustration and the anger, the distrust about the government. In the case of Nigeria, Nigeria has one of the most well-paid set of legislators in the world. I mean, and she pulls out the quote here, our senators make $100,000 a month, if you count their salaries and so on. And in terms of how could they understand it? They don't even have to pay for petrol. All right? Here is a colleague of mine at the University of Ibadan, a young one, saying, the government is saying, no, we need to do this because we need to deregulate. He says, we know that deregulation is not going to automatically eliminate this problem. So while the government is explaining what it's doing, the people are totally distrustful of it in terms of explanation. Now, there's all of this understanding about it. Now, I have one slide here about somebody who does not understand the situation, will never understand the situation, and would make a statement that, in fact, most Nigerians would regard as almost an insult to their intelligence. Right? And that's Dambisa Moyo. And she had an op-ed in the Financial Times saying, yes, you know, you've had the strike in Nigeria and everything else, but basically don't worry. Nigeria is strong enough to get through it. And in fact, the reason why the strike ended is because Nigerian customers just wanted to buy their groceries and get back to work. They have too much vested in the economy. I mean, so you have this very simplistic notion about, you know, it's just if we just let this modern market capitalist system work the way it should, everything is going to be all right. Now, I wrote a message to my colleagues as I was reading their rage. As it was mentioned, I'm both a scholar, I'm also a practitioner, very bold. And I said to them, well, you know, this was just a way of saying, all right, things seem so bad, and I use this idea of the phoenix that's consumed by fire after 500 years. And maybe out of this, something can emerge. And that something is going to be the national project. Now I'm going to give some ideas here about what this project would involve. It concerns Nigeria, but it also concerns other countries. I call it Claiming Democracy, from my colleague Michael Bratton and Carolyn Logan. And this I'm taking here from a speech I gave at Nigeria's 50th anniversary about the need for more efficient, transparent, responsive, and accountable government. And people claiming democracy, looking for more than just the procedures of democracy. Dele Olojide, he's a publisher in Nigeria, and after Nigeria had its elections in 2011, there was a feeling that, yes, things are going to happen. Maybe things are changing. This project would involve what I call building social wealth. Of governments, what are they in positions for, and coming back to some of those basics, provide energy, water, agriculture, law-based government, and so on. Francis Fukuyama, similarly, is making this point, the importance of talking about substantive as well as procedural elections, the procedural democracy, elections as well as jobs, roads, electricity, and so on. I'm not going to spend too much time on this particular slide. It's the idea of governmental accountability, transparency, and efficiency. And here in India, it's very important, the Right to Information Act in India, trying to address some of these same basic issues. Larry Diamond, who talks about the importance of transnational collaboration as part of this process. And remember, he was writing in 2008, long before what's going on now, and saying that citizens are rising up as never before to challenge corruption, defend the electoral process, and demand better governance. Professor Okume, she said, what is the roadmap for getting out of this situation we are? What will provide accountability, transparency, and so on? How can we move the country forward in terms of decent infrastructure? Other quotes calling for the search for pathways out of predicament, getting out of the quagmire. I've listed some considerations here, which I put under the listing of state-nation dilemmas. The Robert Kaplan's book, Monsoon, if any of you are familiar with it, he had this term about, he referred to big messes of countries. And both, this is what imperialism and colonialism has left behind in the world. And he called them big messes of countries. And the ones he cited were Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan. And I added Nigeria. And we can add that. We can add the country. Right? They're these big messes of countries that have been left behind, and the problems that we're now dealing with. Wole Soyinka, the Nigerian author and Nobel laureate at one time, he referred to Nigeria, he says, Nigeria maybe is too problematic and too complicated in terms as a nation. Some of you be familiar with the work of Jeffrey Herbst and his book on power and state in Africa. And Pierre Engelbert has simply had a simple point. Maybe you should just let them fail, these entities, these contraptions, and sort of rebuild states and so on. Ricardo Suarez de Oliveira, who is at Oxford, he had a book looking at the Gulf states, and he used this term of a successful failed state. He said, Nigeria is basically a failed state. If you just look at what states are supposed to do in terms of security and development. But it's successful because it's able to keep going because of the oil income. These are just little statements I pulled out here from my involvement. In 2009, when when Secretary Hillary Clinton was going to Nigeria, and I was advocating very strongly for the U.S. stepping up its involvement in Nigeria. And this was an American senior diplomat who called me after a visit he made prior to her visit. And he said, Richard, I've just spent a few weeks talking to people in Abuja, trying to pursue this idea you were talking about in terms of collaboration. He says, and this was his term, there's no there. Somebody that I could actually sit to. A U.S. aid official, in fact, he'll be visiting Northwestern to give a talk in a few weeks, that I spoke to in early 2011 to talk about Nigeria and my concerns about Nigeria. And he was saying, and his advice to me was, Richard, Nigeria is too risky. There are too many risks. Why don't you look at Ghana or Benin or one of those other countries, right? Coyote Fayemi, when he spoke at the conference in September, and I'll be using his talk to frame my remarks at Brown, and one of his ideas was we need to decentralize this federation. There's too much power in the center. And then finally a Nigerian scholar talking about we have a nation in ruins. But I just put that forward of some of the dilemmas that we talked about. Nigeria 2025, again, when I give this talk, I'll be putting forward what are some of these ingenious solutions and unorthodox and alternative thinking. And these are 5 categories. Again, I won't spend a lot of time on them here, but in each one of those categories, being able to talk about all of the opportunities and resources that you have in Nigeria. This is the cover of the forthcoming book by Debanwe and Obadare. The AfricaPlus project that I mentioned, there are 5 basic components of it. The claiming democracy, the building social wealth, what I call GATE, in terms of governmental accountability, transparency, efficiency. Invent, which is investing in ethical entrepreneurship. And finally, rethinking the state-nation configuration. Now, this quote is just from last week, Abimbola Agboluwaje. He will be working with me and another person who worked with me at Northwestern named Kelly Spence, also helped with the REACH program, and who's now at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We'll be working on a project on corporate social responsibility with some folks at the University of Chicago. And these are people who are going to be looking at the business sector and the role that it can play in moving forward to address some of these issues. Now, I mentioned that I wouldn't have time to talk about the North, but I'm just putting down here, if anybody wanted to have the North, this would almost be a separate talk to explain the situation in northern Nigeria. And there will be these 10 points I would have to go through to really understand that situation. Of course, ending with the centenary of the amalgamation of Nigeria, the amalgamation of northern Nigeria. This is what created modern Nigeria. The amalgamation of this northern region and with what used to be the southern provinces of the time to create this one nation and the implications of that. But these are some of the points, like I said, I'm not going to take the time, but if anybody has questions, would be the things I would have to talk about. Now, I'm going to end with Valentine. It's been a tough set of things I had to go through, but I have two messages. Of course, the heart with the word down below, but this, I go back, 2 millennia. May we walk together, talk together, and understand each other like bright beings joined in right thinking. May we share our bounty with each other, which I think is so critical. This idea of sharing our bounty. That the idea that, here at Northwestern, and we're this, very bountiful place, with all that we have, all of the resources that we have to do. Well, my feeling is that we can't be like the palm wine drinker and say, this is mine, I feel, and fortunately, a lot of, telecommunications and so on does enable us to collaborate and work in new ways. All right, so that is my talk, and I'm glad I've left just a little time to get up some questions. All right, thank you.